When we hear the phrase, a quiet spirit, modern sensibilities often recoil, mistakenly associating the concept with passivity, subjugation, or a tragic lack of boundaries. We have been culturally conditioned to view quietness as a symptom of weakness, assuming that the most powerful person in the room is the loudest, the most reactive, or the most aggressively dominant. But this is a fundamental misinterpretation of both human psychology and neurobiology. A true quiet spirit is not the absence of power. Rather, it is the absolute, unshakable containment of it. It is the ultimate manifestation of autonomic nervous system regulation, redefining feminine grace as apex biological control. To understand the mechanics of this grace, we must first strip away the aesthetic illusions and look directly at the nervous system. The autonomic nervous system operates in two primary states: the sympathetic, which drives our frantic fight-or-flight survival responses, and the parasympathetic, which governs our rest, digest, and socially engaged states. Modern life is fundamentally designed to keep us trapped in chronic sympathetic arousal, flooding our bodies with cortisol and adrenaline over emails, traffic, and interpersonal friction. In this state of perpetual hypervigilance, true grace is biologically impossible because the brain is entirely consumed by the perception of immediate threat. To cultivate a quiet spirit is to actively rewire your neurobiology, shifting your baseline from a state of frantic survival to one of profound, grounded safety. The core visual metaphor for this psychological shift is the deep ocean. If you observe the surface of the ocean during a severe storm, it appears entirely chaotic, defined by violent whitecaps, howling winds, and destructive, reactive energy. This surface weather represents the sympathetic nervous system, the daily stressors, the urgent demands, and the emotional turbulence of the people around us. But if you dive just a few hundred feet below that turbulent surface, the environment undergoes a radical transformation. In the depths of the ocean, the water is entirely still, heavy, and completely untouched by the hurricane raging above. Feminine grace is the psychological mastery of dropping your anchor into this deep ocean, refusing to let the surface weather dictate your internal reality. A woman with a quiet spirit still experiences the storms of life, but she does not allow her core state of being to be violently thrown around by the waves. She has established a secure, parasympathetic baseline that remains structurally sound regardless of external chaos. This requires the development of a fiercely strong internal locus of control, a psychological framework where you recognize that your emotional state is generated from within, not dictated by external circumstances. You stop trying to control the uncontrollable weather, and instead, you master the depth of your own waters. The mathematics of feminine grace can be found in a singular, profound psychological concept, widening the space between stimulus and response. When you are trapped in a sympathetic state, the space between an external trigger and your internal reaction shrinks to absolute zero. Someone insults you, and you immediately snap back. An urgent problem arises, and you instantly spiral into panic. But when you are anchored in the deep ocean of a parasympathetic state, you pry that space open, creating a vital psychological gap. In that widened space lies your freedom, your internal locus of control, and your capacity to choose a graceful, measured response rather than a frantic reaction. To truly understand how this quiet spirit is forged in the fires of adversity rather than born from a life of ease, we must examine the psychological evolution of Audrey Hepburn. Today, she is universally immortalized as the global icon of effortless elegance, remembered for her delicate posture, her soft-spoken demeanor, and her radiant, gentle charm. However, the neurobiological bedrock of her signature grace was not a product of Hollywood finishing schools or genetic luck. It was a profound psychological adaptation born from the horrific, unimaginable trauma of World War II. During the Dutch famine of 1944, known as the Hunger Winter, a teenage Audrey faced near starvation, surviving on endive, nettles, and tulip bulbs. She lived under the constant, terrifying threat of Nazi occupation, witnessing executions in the streets and enduring severe malnutrition that permanently altered her physical development. Her nervous system was subjected to the absolute maximum threshold of sympathetic arousal, a daily, literal fight for survival in a waking nightmare. Under such extreme, prolonged trauma, the standard psychological outcome is chronic neuroticism, deep-seated bitterness, or lifelong emotional dysregulation. But Audrey's psyche performed an extraordinary pivot, adapting to the chaos by cultivating an intensely regulated, protective inner world. She could not control the war, the violence, or the starvation, so she developed an ironclad internal locus of control to survive. Her later elegance was, in fact, the physical manifestation of a trauma-adapted, highly regulated nervous system that refused to be chaotic. The deliberate slowness of her movements, the quietness of her voice, and her unshakable poise were born from a deep biological need to conserve energy and maintain internal safety amidst external terror. She chose to anchor herself in the deep ocean because the surface of her early life was entirely unsurvivable. Audrey Hepburn proves that a quiet spirit is not a symptom of a sheltered, naive life. It is a fiercely constructed psychological fortress. It is the conscious decision to transmute unimaginable pain into unshakable, grounded self-possession. While most of us are not dodging bombs or surviving famines, the modern woman's nervous system often reacts to daily life as if she is. To illustrate how this neurobiological framework applies today, we turn to our first case study, the anxious overachiever. Let us call her Alina, a highly successful corporate director who had built her entire identity on speed, hypervigilance, and relentless productivity. Alina was severely addicted to her own cortisol, equating a racing heart and rapid-fire speech with competence and high performance. If she was not stressed, she felt completely out of control, constantly anticipating problems before they even occurred. Alina's surface ocean was a perpetual Category 5 hurricane, and her daily life was a masterclass in chronic sympathetic arousal. She spoke in rushed, breathless sentences, her shoulders were permanently tense, and she reacted to minor inconveniences with the same physiological intensity as a life-threatening emergency. She believed her frantic energy was the source of her success, failing to realize that it was actively destroying her health and alienating her peers. Alina's journey to cultivating a quiet spirit did not begin with changing her personality. It began with the clinical dismantling of her nervous system's false alarms. She had to learn the profound difference between moving fast and actually being effective. The primary intervention for Alina was the implementation of somatic tracking, a psychological technique used to safely observe physical sensations without reacting to them. When a stressful email arrived, Alina was instructed to pause and mentally scan her body, noticing her tightening chest and shallow breathing. Instead of immediately firing off a frantic reply to relieve her anxiety, she practiced sitting with the discomfort, actively widening the space between the stimulus and her response. She learned to observe her own physiological weather from the safety of the deep ocean, recognizing that a spike in adrenaline did not require her immediate obedience. This was the beginning of reclaiming her internal locus of control. To manually override her sympathetic nervous system, Alina integrated strict breathwork protocols into her daily routine, specifically focusing on prolonged exhalations. By making her exhales twice as long as her inhales, she directly stimulated her vagus nerve, sending a powerful biological signal of safety to her brain. Over several months, the physical manifestation of this internal work was staggering. Her rapid-fire speech naturally slowed down, dropping into a lower, more resonant register. Her movements lost their jerky, anxious quality, replaced by a deliberate, fluid grace that commanded immediate respect in boardroom meetings. Alina did not lose her corporate edge. In fact, her new parasympathetic baseline made her infinitely more dangerous and effective. Because she was no longer instantly reactive, she became the calmest person in every room, automatically positioning her as the psychological anchor for her entire team. She discovered that true power is never loud, rushed, or frantically trying to prove itself. By mastering her autonomic nervous system, Alina embodied the quiet spirit, proving that feminine grace is the ultimate, untouchable form of self-possession. While establishing a physiological baseline of safety is the vital first step, maintaining that profound peace requires a formidable psychological architecture. A quiet spirit cannot possibly survive in an open, unprotected field where anyone is allowed to walk in and trample the soil. To remain soft, receptive, and deeply at peace on the inside, a woman must construct an impenetrable psychological perimeter on the outside. This brings us to the internal mechanics of emotional regulation and the absolute necessity of establishing unyielding boundaries to create prerequisite psychological safety. Feminine grace is never about being universally accessible or endlessly accommodating. It is about being highly and unapologetically selective. The guiding visual metaphor for this internal psychological structure is the walled garden. Imagine a lush, thriving sanctuary filled with delicate blooms, quiet pathways, and serene, undisturbed fountains. This garden does not remain beautiful because it is left to the mercy of the surrounding wilderness. It thrives specifically because it is enclosed by thick, towering stone walls. The heavy iron gates to this garden are deliberate, secure, and fiercely guarded by the owner at all times. Only those who respect the delicate ecosystem of the garden are granted entry, while toxic elements, chaos, and invasive weeds are permanently locked outside. In human psychology, this walled garden represents the absolute necessity of emotional compartmentalization. Society often mislabels strict boundaries as cold, defensive, or unloving, but they are actually the exact prerequisite for true warmth and vulnerability. If you possess no psychological walls, you must constantly exist in a state of defensive hypervigilance to protect yourself from the world's endless, draining intrusions. However, when your perimeter is entirely secure, you no longer need to wear heavy emotional armor in your daily life. You can afford to be soft, gracious, and deeply open because you know exactly who and what is allowed through your gates. To observe the sheer survival power of this psychological architecture, we must examine the extraordinary life transition of Princess Grace of Monaco. Before her royal marriage, Grace Kelly was a legendary Hollywood icon subjected to an industry that notoriously demands the complete, boundaryless exposure of its stars. The studio system expected her to be infinitely accessible, eagerly offering up her private life, her inner emotions, and her identity for mass public entertainment. Yet, even in the early stages of her acting career, she possessed an enigmatic, aloof quality that fascinated the global public. She was already beginning to construct the heavy stone walls of her internal garden, refusing to give her core self away to the masses. When she eventually left Hollywood to marry Prince Rainier III, she did not step into a carefree fairy tale. She stepped into an institution defined by intense, unforgiving structure. The transition to Monaco royalty required her to immediately navigate deeply entrenched political dynamics, suffocating social protocols, and a relentless, intrusive global press. Had she remained an unprotected open field, absorbing every harsh critique, wild rumor, and heavy institutional pressure, the psychological weight would have completely crushed her. Instead, Princess Grace weaponized the walled garden, utilizing masterful emotional detachment and dignified restraint as her ultimate defense mechanisms against the madness. She survived the glittering but restrictive cage of royalty by fiercely and intentionally compartmentalizing her identity. There was the public Princess Grace, flawless, endlessly gracious, and impeccably composed. And then there was the private inner sanctuary that absolutely no one was allowed to access without her explicit permission. She mastered the brilliant art of being physically present and warmly engaging while remaining entirely psychologically protected from the chaos swirling around her. By maintaining this profound emotional detachment from the public's endless demands, she successfully preserved her sanity and her core identity. Her legendary poise was never a passive, inherent trait. It was the active, disciplined curation of her internal landscape. The architecture of this walled garden relies heavily on the psychological principle of emotional differentiation. This is the vital cognitive ability to recognize that you are a completely separate entity from the people around you, and that their emotional states do not dictate your own. When someone brings their frantic chaos to your gates, emotional differentiation allows you to observe their storm without opening the door and inviting the hurricane inside. You can look over the stone wall, acknowledge their distress with genuine compassion, and then calmly step back down into your peaceful sanctuary. You are actively eradicating the self-destructive need to over-identify with temporary emotional states that simply do not belong to you. To see how this life-saving architecture is built in real time, we turn to our specific case study, the reactive empath. Let us call her Clara, a woman whose entire existence was defined by a tragic, exhausting lack of psychological walls. Clara genuinely believed that to be a good, caring person, she had to fully absorb the pain, anger, and anxiety of everyone she loved. Her extended family dynamic was highly volatile, constantly marked by endless crises, loud arguments, and deep-seated emotional dysregulation. Because she entirely lacked emotional differentiation, Clara's internal garden was a trampled, chaotic wasteland where anyone could dump their emotional garbage. Whenever her mother called with a panicked emergency, or her sister vented her latest outrage, Clara's emotional state would immediately sink to their frantic frequency. She fundamentally confused toxic enmeshment with empathy, convinced that if she did not feel their pain as intensely as they did, she was betraying them. This boundaryless existence left her chronically exhausted, deeply resentful, and completely devoid of anything resembling a quiet spirit. Clara was essentially standing in a wide-open field during a raging thunderstorm, constantly wondering why she was always getting struck by lightning. She desperately needed to learn that true empathy does not ever require emotional self-immolation. The clinical intervention for Clara began with intense cognitive reframing regarding the true definition and purpose of a boundary. She had to understand that building a strong psychological wall was not an act of aggression against her family, but a necessary act of preservation for herself. Her therapist introduced the concept of compassionate detachment, teaching Clara how to witness another person's emotional reality without automatically absorbing it into her own body. When her family's familiar chaos flared up, Clara was instructed to mentally visualize her heavy garden gates swinging shut and locking securely. She was taught to transition from uncontrollably absorbing their issues to merely observing them with a neutral, grounded, and highly differentiated presence. The ultimate test of her new architecture came during a particularly explosive family holiday, an environment that would normally trigger Clara into a spiral of reactive anxiety. When the familiar, loud arguments inevitably erupted over dinner, Clara did not jump into the fray to mediate, nor did she absorb the toxic energy in the room. Instead, she fiercely practiced emotional differentiation, mentally repeating the anchoring mantra: "Their urgency is not my emergency." She remained polite, soft-spoken, and entirely detached from the swirling drama unfolding directly in front of her. She looked over the stone wall of her internal garden, observed the storm with objective clarity, and consciously chose to stay inside her sanctuary. Over time, Clara's absolute refusal to participate in the emotional enmeshment completely altered the entire family dynamic. Because she no longer absorbed their chaos or validated their panic, they could no longer use her as an emotional dumping ground. Her quiet spirit finally emerged as a direct, beautiful result of this fierce, unyielding emotional compartmentalization. She discovered the profound truth that she could still deeply love her family while simultaneously refusing to let them trample her inner peace. Clara's transformation proved that you do not have to harden your heart to survive a chaotic world. You simply have to build a stronger wall around it. The cultivation of a quiet spirit is fundamentally about taking absolute ownership of your psychological real estate. It requires the brutal, unapologetic eviction of any external force that demands access to your inner peace without earning the right to be there. A woman who embodies true feminine grace knows that her softness is a rare privilege granted only to those who respect her gates. By mastering emotional detachment and building the walled garden, she creates the ultimate psychological safety required to thrive. She remains deeply receptive to the breathtaking beauty of life precisely because she is ruthlessly protected from its invasive toxicity. While an impenetrable internal perimeter guarantees your emotional survival, this profound peace inevitably begins to project outward, fundamentally altering the social dynamics of every room a woman enters. This brings us to the fascinating realm of interpersonal neurobiology and the exact science of how human nervous systems continuously interact. We are biologically wired to constantly scan our environment for social cues, unconsciously synchronizing our emotional states with those around us through a physiological process called limbic resonance. When you enter a space operating on a frantic frequency, your brain naturally wants to match that chaos to ensure your survival. But when a woman walks into that same room carrying a heavily regulated, parasympathetic baseline, she instantly and completely disrupts the entire energetic ecosystem. The guiding visual metaphor for this external manifestation of grace is the magnetic North Pole. The magnetic North Pole does not aggressively chase compass needles, nor does it shout or exert visible, violent force to demand compliance from the world. It simply exists as an invisible, unmoving, and immensely powerful center of gravity that anchors the entire hemisphere. Because of its sheer, unshakable density, every compass needle within its vast vicinity naturally and silently aligns itself to that singular, dominant point. A woman possessing a truly quiet spirit operates with this exact same magnetic physics in her social, familial, and professional circles. She generates intense interpersonal magnetism and leadership, not by dominating conversations, but through the staggering power of unspoken physical presence. While others desperately compete for attention by raising their voices, interrupting, and frantically leaning into the space of others, she remains deeply anchored in her own physical center. Her extreme verbal restraint and active listening create a psychological vacuum that naturally draws people toward her without her having to lift a finger. By refusing to match the insecure, reactive energy of the room, she becomes the stabilizing frequency that unconsciously regulates the nervous systems of everyone around her. She does not ever have to demand respect or aggressively assert her boundaries. Her profound quietness effortlessly compels it. To witness the absolute zenith of this magnetic, non-reactive presence under the most harrowing circumstances imaginable, we must study Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis during the traumatic days following the 1963 assassination. In the immediate aftermath of her husband's brutal public murder, she was thrust into the center of an unprecedented global crisis, surrounded by frantic politicians, weeping staff, and an utterly destabilized nation. The natural, expected human response to such sudden, catastrophic trauma is total psychological collapse, hysterical vocalization, or erratic, panicked movement. Yet her conduct during those dark days remains a historical masterclass in the staggering power of feminine grace and absolute visual composure. She did not scream, she did not thrash, and she completely refused to be swept away by the overwhelming tide of national panic. Instead, she instinctively dropped into a state of profound, deliberate slowness, utilizing extreme verbal restraint to physically anchor a country in freefall. When she did speak, her voice remained in a low, unhurried register, entirely devoid of the frantic, high-pitched cadence that typically accompanies severe psychological trauma. Her physical movements were meticulously measured, from the stoic way she stood beside Lyndon B. Johnson during his rushed swearing-in, to her iconic, silent walk behind the horse-drawn caisson. She understood on a primal level that in a moment of absolute chaos, the most dominant force is never the loudest voice, but the most deeply rooted presence. By maintaining a quiet spirit, she single-handedly regulated the emotional nervous system of the entire American public, serving as their unshakable magnetic North Pole. While most women will thankfully never face the tragedy of a national assassination, modern life constantly presents micro-battles that demand this exact type of verbal restraint and physical composure. This brings us to our next psychological case study, the overexplainer. Let us call her Maya, a bright, capable woman whose entire interpersonal dynamic was driven by the frantic, exhausting energy of an anxious attachment style. Maya was deeply terrified of being misunderstood, disliked, or perceived as difficult, which manifested as a compulsive need to endlessly communicate and justify her every action. If she set a simple boundary or declined an invitation, she immediately followed it with a breathless, 5-minute monologue of apologies and nervous explanations. Maya's social presence was the exact opposite of a grounded center of gravity. She was a frantic, spinning compass needle, desperately trying to align with everyone else's approval. She utterly despised awkward silences, viewing them as a terrifying sign of interpersonal failure, and would frantically fill any pause in conversation with self-deprecating humor or unnecessary chatter. This chronic over-explaining completely eroded her personal authority, unconsciously signaling to others that she fundamentally lacked confidence in her own decisions and required their permission to exist. Her nervous system was trapped in a continuous, exhausting loop of seeking external validation, leaving her physically drained and socially diminished. Maya desperately needed to understand that her endless stream of words was not building genuine connection. It was actively bleeding her personal power. The clinical intervention for Maya focused entirely on the terrifying but transformative practice of extreme verbal restraint. She was tasked with stripping her communication down to its absolute bare minimum, systematically removing every single minimizing phrase, apology, and nervous justification from her daily vocabulary. When she needed to deliver a no or set a firm boundary, she was instructed to state it clearly, drop her voice into a low register, and then do something completely radical: close her mouth. Maya had to learn how to physically sit in the burning, uncomfortable fire of a pregnant pause without rushing to rescue the other person from the silence. She was actively rewiring her anxious attachment into a secure attachment by proving to her own brain that interpersonal silence was not a biological threat to her survival. The initial stages of this practice felt excruciatingly awkward for Maya, as her dysregulated nervous system screamed at her to fill the empty air and diffuse the perceived tension. But as she fiercely persisted, the social dynamics in her professional and personal life began to shift in astonishing, undeniable ways. Because she was no longer nervously justifying her boundaries, the people in her life suddenly began to accept her words with absolute, unquestioning seriousness. The less she spoke, the more psychological weight her statements carried, naturally drawing the undivided attention and respect of her peers whenever she did choose to contribute. She transformed from a nervous, chattering presence into an unhurried, quietly confident woman whose deliberate pacing effortlessly commanded the room. Maya's evolution perfectly illustrates the ultimate paradox of the quiet spirit. Withdrawing your frantic, anxious energy is precisely how you assert your most dominant presence. When a woman roots herself in the psychology of secure attachment, she completely stops viewing conversations as desperate battlegrounds for validation. She embraces active listening not as a passive, submissive surrender, but as a grounded, powerful observation that allows others to reveal their true underlying motives. Her profound silence acts as a mirror, reflecting the insecurities of the chaotic while providing a deep sense of safety for those who seek her steady counsel. In this way, feminine grace is recognized for what it truly is: an invisible, stabilizing anchor that naturally aligns the world to its quiet, unmoving center. While the ability to act as a stabilizing anchor transforms the immediate social dynamics of a room, the ultimate test of feminine grace lies in its long-term endurance. How does a woman maintain this profound psychological architecture when the storms of modern life refuse to break, and the pressure becomes relentlessly sustained? The answer is found not in building thicker, heavier armor, but in mastering the paradoxical physics of extreme, yielding flexibility. The final operative metaphor for the quiet spirit is the bamboo forest, a biological marvel that effortlessly survives the most catastrophic weather systems on Earth. When a Category 5 typhoon strikes, rigid oak trees are violently uprooted and shattered because they stubbornly resist the overwhelming force of the wind. The bamboo, however, survives the hurricane by entirely surrendering to it, bending completely to the ground without ever snapping its core. This astonishing resilience is not a symptom of weakness. It is the result of a deeply interconnected, massive root system that firmly secures the plant to the earth. The roots of a single bamboo shoot spread horizontally, intertwining with the roots of the entire forest to create an unbreakable subterranean grid. In human psychology, this perfectly symbolizes the absolute mastery of non-resistance to reality. A woman with a cultivated, quiet spirit does not exhaust her energetic reserves fighting against unavoidable friction, demanding that the storm cease its raging. Instead, she relies on her deeply cultivated spiritual roots, allowing her ego to bend flexibly to the demands of reality while her core identity remains completely unbroken. To witness the absolute zenith of this unshakable physical and psychological stillness, we must examine one of the most pivotal moments in modern history. The 1950s bus protest in Montgomery is universally celebrated as a triumph of political activism, but it was fundamentally a masterclass in the staggering power of a quiet spirit. The woman at the center of this storm did not initiate a screaming match, hurl insults, or resort to frantic, dysregulated physical violence when confronted by overwhelming, systemic hostility. She weaponized a profound, deeply rooted stillness that was born from an intensely cultivated spiritual conviction and an absolute certainty of her inherent self-worth. Her refusal to surrender her seat was executed with zero raised voices, projecting an impenetrable psychological dignity that completely paralyzed the aggression of the authorities. She did not need to physically fight because her nervous system was entirely anchored in the absolute truth of her own humanity. Her quiet spirit was not passive compliance. It was an apex display of non-resistance to her own internal truth, heavily anchored by a spiritual root system that refused to snap. She bent the entire moral arc of a nation simply by remaining physically seated and psychologically immovable. By refusing to match the loud, frantic, and hateful energy of her oppressors, she forced the world to reckon with the terrifying, undeniable power of absolute emotional regulation. This historical moment proves that feminine grace is never a fragile, delicate aesthetic easily crushed by the harshness of the real world. It is, in fact, the most formidable psychological weapon a human being can wield, capable of dismantling entire systems of chaos through the sheer force of unshakable stillness. To understand how this deep root system is practically cultivated in the exhausting landscape of modern womanhood, we turn to our final case study, the burnout people-pleaser. Let us call her Sarah, a devoted mother and wife whose entire psychological framework had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of domestic and professional demands. Sarah had fundamentally confused the concept of feminine grace with infinite, self-sacrificial availability, believing that a good woman must constantly pour from her own cup until it is bone dry. Her daily life was an endless, frantic marathon of anticipating the needs of her children, managing her husband's schedule, and absorbing the emotional labor of her entire household. As a result, her internal bamboo forest had no root system whatsoever. She was entirely hollowed out, chronically resentful, and suffering from severe neurological burnout. Sarah's energy reserves were so deeply depleted that her nervous system was trapped in a perpetual state of defensive exhaustion, leaving her highly reactive and profoundly disconnected from her own identity. She had no quiet spirit because she had absolutely no silence in her life. Her reality was a continuous loop of external serving and digital overstimulation. The clinical intervention for Sarah required a radical, unapologetic cessation of her constant outward output to rebuild her internal architecture from the ground up. She was prescribed a rigid protocol of radical solitude, requiring her to physically remove herself from her family for 1 hour every single day, completely free from demands or interruptions. This was not a luxury. It was a psychological triage designed to stop the catastrophic hemorrhaging of her energetic reserves. During this sacred hour, Sarah implemented strict digital minimalism, completely severing her nervous system from the frantic, dopamine-driven feedback loops of social media and endless text messages. She replaced her phone with rhythmic, grounding daily rituals, such as slow, intentional journaling, silent meditation, and the simple, tactile practice of brewing and drinking a single cup of tea without multitasking. She was instructed to focus entirely on the sensory experience, the warmth of the mug, the rising steam, and the absolute, unbroken stillness of the room. Initially, her dysregulated brain fought this sensory deprivation, flooding her with intense guilt for not being overtly productive or actively serving her family. Her mind screamed that taking this time was inherently selfish, a direct violation of her deeply ingrained people-pleasing programming. But as she relentlessly maintained the boundary, her deep root system finally began to grow, anchoring her identity in something other than her endless utility to other people. Sarah discovered that by intentionally starving her brain of external chaos, she was actively feeding her capacity for profound, internal peace. The transformation in Sarah's household was nothing short of revolutionary, proving that a woman's energetic state dictates the emotional weather of her entire family. As she replenished her own reserves, her chronic resentment evaporated, replaced by a genuine, overflowing warmth that she had not felt in over a decade. She no longer snapped at her children over minor inconveniences, and she stopped aggressively managing her husband, allowing a beautiful, effortless harmony to naturally settle over the home. Sarah had successfully cultivated the bamboo forest. She could gracefully bend to the chaotic demands of motherhood without ever losing her center or snapping under the pressure. Her quiet spirit was ultimately resurrected through the disciplined, daily refusal to abandon herself. The ultimate secret to maintaining this profound psychological blueprint lies in the remarkable, scientifically proven mechanics of neuroplasticity. The human brain is not a static, unchangeable organ. It is highly malleable, constantly rewiring its physical structure based on the inputs and behaviors it repeatedly experiences. This phenomenon, known as self-directed neuroplasticity, means that you are the active architect of your own nervous system. When you spend years trapped in chronic stress, people-pleasing, and frantic reactivity, you literally hardwire your brain to make anxiety its default neurological state. The neurons that fire together, wire together, creating deeply entrenched highways of panic and emotional exhaustion. However, the exact opposite is also true, and this is where the true, lasting hope for cultivating a quiet spirit eternally resides. By engaging in the repeated, daily practices of mindfulness, intentional slowness, and sensory deprivation, you actively carve new, parasympathetic neural pathways into your brain. Every single time you choose to widen the space between stimulus and response, you strengthen the neurological architecture of feminine grace. Every time you enforce a boundary, practice radical solitude, or refuse to absorb the emotional chaos of the room, you are physically altering the gray matter of your prefrontal cortex. Over time, this intense, disciplined psychological work transitions from being a conscious, exhausting effort to an entirely automatic, unconscious baseline. You do not have to constantly fight to remain calm. Your deeply rewired brain simply defaults to a state of profound, unshakable safety. The quiet spirit ceases to be a psychological technique you practice and permanently becomes the absolute core of who you are. This journey requires immense courage, as it demands the complete surrender of the frantic, protective mechanisms that society has conditioned us to rely upon. It asks you to abandon the frantic, loud survival tactics of the modern world and root yourself deeply in the unshakable stillness of the bamboo forest. Feminine grace is not a passive aesthetic or a genetic inheritance. It is the ultimate psychological triumph over a chaotic world. It is the fierce, beautiful realization that your peace is sacred, your stillness is powerful, and your spirit is entirely untouchable. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the psychological framework of feminine grace. Please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the incredible power of your own mind.